sexuality is not dictated by a deity. It's developed from empathy, dependence, and love. My morality accepts everybody's sexuality, is more concerned with inequality and the validations from above. My morality is not set into stone tablets.
Welcome to another episode of The Nuns. Tonight we have with us Jen Peeples of Godless Bitches, an Atheist Experience, and Taylor Malone from Planned Parenthood in Washington State, and Aron Ra. Lalandra and I will be talking about abstinence-only policy failure. We'll be talking about the Wendy Davis filibuster, and we'll be talking about abortion and reproductive rights. Abstinence-only sex education.
Let's start with the failure of abstinence-only education, and we're going to talk about our experiences with sex education in a minute. But first, I wanted to play for you a sound clip of one of our legislators here in Texas, and his opinion on sex education. So hold on here a second. This is our Representative Steve Toth of the Woodlands. He's talking to Donna Howard, one of the good guys. From here you go.
Educating. I'm saying contraceptives.
Okay, so let's just give them more contraceptives.
Yes,
that'll
let's do.
take care of everything.
No, it won't.
If you're
No,
right,
it won't. But it will prevent a lot of unwanted pregnancies.
No,
and
it won't.
women, as you know,
We
through
know
all
it won't.
history, have had abortions, whether they were legal or not.
My wife,
And we would like for them to be
my wife worked in
safe
a home for unwed
and
moms.
with a qualified physician.
One of the little kids that was born, his name is David. David came about as a result of his mom and dad, who were just 16 at the time, going to a Planned Parenthood deal where they taught them how to use contraceptives. They were not sexually active
Contraceptives
at
fail
that point.
periodically. That's not really the issue.
They got into the car, and they were so hot and bothered from this deal, he couldn't even get the condom on.
Wow, well,
And there
that's
was
really
David.
an interesting anecdote.
Well,
Okay, there you have it. Sex education, that Planned Parenthood is apparently really hotsy-totsy and gets people hot and bothered. And that caused an unplanned pregnancy. And he also said that having more contraceptives wouldn't solve the problem. That kind of sets up the attitude here in Texas that if you just don't have sex and wait until you're married in the traditional way, in the Christian way, right? Then we wouldn't have all of these problems. And I don't think that is a very realistic way to talk about sex education in 2013. And I wanted to ask the panel members what was their experience with sex education, not just in school, but at home, and how did that help you make decisions as an adult? Let's start with Taylor.
Well, I grew up in Mississippi, and so there wasn't really much sex education to talk about. Most of it was you wait until you're married, you don't have sex before marriage, you don't use birth control, and you don't have an abortion. I was lucky, though, because my mom was from New York City, so she was a little bit more liberal when it came to that. She'd had my brother when she was 19, and she'd had an abortion a couple of years after that, so she was definitely more adamant on knowing what birth control was and how to use it. But at the same time, she was very supportive of the you don't have sex, excuse me, you don't have sex until you're married. I'll know if you have sex and you're going to be in trouble kind of mindset. When I moved to Florida, we had sex education in our public schools, but it was mostly focused on what happens when you hit puberty, how to use deodorant, how to use tampons, and much less about how to prevent pregnancy. But at that point, my mom started working for Planned Parenthood, which gave me the opportunity to volunteer there and to get a pretty decent education from her, from the other nurses, from the doctors there, and just from the general materials. Then once I was in high school in Washington State, I was lucky enough to be in a more liberal area, and we actually had representatives from Planned Parenthood come to our school, talk to us about sex, talk to us about contraceptives, STIs, prevention, and how to take care of ourselves. So I think if it hadn't been for access to Planned Parenthood, both through my mom as she worked there and through my peers in high school, I would have received far less of a sex education than I did, and I would be much less aware of my reproductive rights than I am now.
Do you think it's likely that, like this representative was saying, that the presentation that you watched from Planned Parenthood would get anybody hot and bothered such that they would run out and not even put a condom on?
If you get turned on by close-up pictures of herpes and various types of discharge, then maybe. But Planned Parenthood did a very good job of making us aware of the risks of unprotected sex, and that wasn't always an appealing thing, and it definitely wasn't a sexually arousing situation. So I'm not sure what that person's scenario was or how they responded to the sex education that Planned Parenthood provides, but in my experience, it wasn't really a sexually titillating situation.
That was a state representative here in Texas. We're discussing some pretty heavy anti-abortion laws, and they have defunded Planned Parenthood here in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're listening to testimony right now, so that was up-to-the-minute testimony that Planned Parenthood has this scintillating sex education, apparently. But, you know, it's not true. But let's ask Jen. What was your experience growing up with sex education?
Well, I was fortunate that, like Taylor, my parents were much more enlightened than probably was average at the time. When I was in junior high and high school, this was like in the late 70s, and in junior high I was in Louisiana and actually got pretty good sex education. I wouldn't say that it was comprehensive. But what they gave us was medically accurate. I don't remember us being lied to so much, other than they tended to emphasize the failure rates of condoms, probably more than was warranted. And then in high school, I don't think, normally in high schools that I attended, the story was, well, they hand this off to the coach, and the coach ends up teaching some awkward sex ed class. Well, I guess our coaches didn't want to be distracted from coaching championship teams, so they handed it off to Planned Parenthood. So we actually had a Planned Parenthood rep come in, I think a couple of times a year, and teach a class on sex education. So again, far from a comprehensive sex education class in school, but it was medically accurate. And then later on in college, I ended up volunteering for Planned Parenthood and doing some work there. So I would say overall, I got a pretty decent sex education, both from the information my parents provided and from what was provided in schools. But of course, at the time, there wasn't a law that said you had to lie to kids in school when you presented sex education to them.
That's a good point. With you and Taylor, what decade did you guys get sex education in?
My sex ed was in the 70s. Now,
Okay.
Mine was in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Okay. And it was in another state, right? It was in Florida, right?
It was a combination of Florida and Washington.
Okay. Because here in Texas, in the 1990s, George Bush passed abstinence-only education, and that was become the law of the land. And I got sex education in the 80s, so I watched The Miracle of Life, which was still more medically accurate and factually correct than the sex education that was delivered to my 6th grade students in 2006. Go ahead, Jen.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say that, by the time I was, I guess, late in high school, I had realized that I was probably gay. So um, one of the big gaps in my sex education was that it never addressed gay kids at all. That was, a taboo. Nobody was gay. We weren't acknowledging that. And of course nobody was getting pregnant either, except for the kids that were. So, and in fact, one of the big scandals at the time when I graduated from high school was there was a girl in high school in my senior year who got pregnant. And unlike most of the girls who got pregnant in high school, she didn't leave high school in shame. She stayed and graduated. And she was actually, we had 4 valedictorians in the class, and she was actually one of them.
Good for her. How about Mr. Aron? How was your sex education?
My sex ed was in one of the suburbs of Los Angeles in the early 70s. I was lucky enough that when I was at that age, I was growing up in a Cheech and Chong movie, and it was a lot different than what anybody's going through in Texas. What they focused on was acne and issues with puberty, and there was very little actual sex. There was really not a lot of venereal disease, stuff like that, until we got to high school. And then they started focusing on what they then called at the time VD. And that's probably, I think, a very serious thing that needs to be taught to kids as a definite priority. My primary interest in use of condoms or any kind of a birth control thing was really not to stave off pregnancy. It was to avoid sexually transmitted diseases. That's it. Because in the 70s it was kind of laughable what was going around then. I mean, everything was curable, so it was all considered temporary. And then of course you had AIDS, and the climate changed dramatically.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I remember seeing really graphic pictures of various sexually transmitted infections, to the point where I think by the time I was in the 9th grade, I could probably have diagnosed someone, just from a photograph. It's like, oh yes, that's soft chancre. I know exactly what that is, and here's what you need to do about it.
So you have the same experience. You had Planned Parenthood do your presentation. So this representative who's saying it got people hot and bothered, that's kind of preposterous, right?
I'm gonna have to call bullshit on that. Hopefully I can say bullshit on this podcast, but I don't think that actually happened that way. I've seen a lot of different Planned Parenthood presentations. They're fairly clinical, and Taylor can probably back me up on that. They're not designed to get someone sexually aroused.
Well, we have seen my wife, of course, she was a teacher. That one of the classes that she was in, they had one of those family organizations send in a speaker to give the abstinence-only sex education bit. And I should probably let my wife tell the story, but before I let her do that, I want to voice my own opinion about this guy who's coming up with this little personal anecdote. These people, and my wife's going to give you another demonstration of that when she tells the story, but these people are not above lying to the students and using whatever kind of propaganda they can to get away with whatever they can. It seems to be the staple of their demographic. It's very disturbing. When we talk about the Wendy Davis thing, we're going to be talking about that shadowy sort of villainous image again, about lying and cheating and doing whatever you can to promote your personal agenda. This guy is very obvious in his attempt. It couldn't be that you have two 16-year-old kids who are hot and bothered anyway. And it couldn't be that you've got dumb kids who can't figure out how to work these things. right? That can't be.
Yeah.
That's assuming that any part of his story is correct at all. But this guy seems to what he knows about contraception seems to have been directed by the Pope. Remember when the Pope went and told people in Africa that the use of condoms spreads AIDS? This is the kind of mindset that we're dealing with from this political faction. And this is why, my wife and I have had to become atheists, or had to become activists in this kind of a venue.
So, what would the explanation be if he's not? That story didn't happen? Is he not telling the truth? Is he ignorant, or does he dislike Planned Parenthood that much that he's trying to pawn the blame for unplanned pregnancies on sex education?
The thing with Planned Parenthood's outreach, especially to high schools, is that it has to be approved by the school board. So, for example, here in Spokane, when our teen outreach group wanted to come up with a curriculum that they could present to different high schools, they had to present it in front of the Spokane County School Board, and it had to be approved. So it's not as though Planned Parenthood employees are just going into high schools willy-nilly presenting whatever they feel like. It's an approved curriculum that's based on medical fact. So I don't know that it's fair to say that he just lied. It could be that he heard an anecdote, it was exaggerated, could have been hyperbole, but I highly doubt that any school board would have approved a curriculum that was so sexually exciting that it would lead teenagers to just go out and have sex.
Well, I would actually be willing to go on record and say I think he lied. I think he straight up lied about it. And I'm not saying that two 16-year-olds couldn't have jumped in a car and gotten all hot and bothered and they did not know how to use a condom and somebody got pregnant. I'm sure that could happen. But I don't think it was as a result of the Planned Parenthood presentation.
Yeah, and so Jen and I are on the same record for the same comment there.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you my story now that Aron was about to tell for me, but I'm going to tell you it now. I'm a sixth grade teacher, and that is when a lot of children in Texas get to talk about sex education. So they had a family group come in, and this is Abstinence Only Times 2006, and this older man with his pants pulled up over his navel, I'm not joking and I'm not exaggerating, came in to give the presentation, and the highlights of his presentation are stuff like putting a picture of on the overhead of a diagram of a penis and saying, you see this? If you have sex, it might get cut off if you get penile cancer. I mean, how common is that, right? And it was mainly scare stuff. But then at the end, he allowed the boys to ask questions anonymously, and one of the questions he read off was, one of the boys had asked, does oral sex feel good? And he answered, no, it doesn't. Because the whole time you're thinking you're getting an STD. He said that with a straight face. And that wasn't, that, from what I remembered, I saw the girls' presentation too. Both presentations spent a lot of time talking about the failure rates of condoms. So they discouraged condoms, and this was in West Texas, with the second highest repeat teen pregnancy rate in Texas, which has the largest repeat teen pregnancy rate in the country.
Wait, we need to clarify that. Texas has the highest rate of repeat teen pregnancies, just to clarify.
Do you guys think that the sex education, well, we didn't get to sex education that you received from your community, like religious instruction when you went to church. I don't know how many of us here were church, but myself, I grew up in two churches, Southern Baptist and Catholic churches, because my parents were divorced and I went to church a lot. And I think we also skipped Shannon, so go ahead, Shannon. What was your experience with sex education at home, and did you have any religious instruction in that area, and what decade was that?
I received the bulk of my sex education in the mid 90s. I didn't receive any instruction at home. My parents were terrified to talk about it. My dad pretty much he was pretty religious, and he hammered home the whole wait until you're married thing. Would tell me about how him and my mom had only been with each other, and they were high school sweethearts, and they only had sex with each other, even though I know they had sex before they were married. In school, I went to school in Maryland, close to Annapolis, so it was pretty liberal. And the education was clinical, but I was very lucky that I had a very expressive and outspoken science teacher. So she helped to fill in those blanks and make it a little bit more realistic. When it came time for me to apply my sex education, I did the responsible thing. I went to Planned Parenthood, and I learned myself.
A lot of people had experiences with Planned Parenthood, so it's a shame that Planned Parenthood has been defunded here in Texas. It's been such a resource for other generations of women.
Anything that might benefit poor people is sure to be exorcised from this state.
I have another angle I want to look at this at. 80% of Christians from 18 to 29 are having sex, and outside of marriage. 88% non-Christians. And growing up, I always got the message, you need to be a virgin on your wedding night, save yourself for the person you married. And that, I think, is behind a lot of our legislature's boneheaded attempts to dictate whether people have contraception, whether they have access to abortion. It's this old traditional way of looking at the way people have sex that doesn't even match their own group. So my question here is, did you have any pressure, or were you raised to save yourself for marriage? And I guess anyone could jump in there.
Yeah, I think my parents, you know, I think they made noises to that effect early on, but, you know, as we got older, both for my brother and me, I think they were fairly realistic about it. They understood that, you know, teenagers are going to have sex. It's a normal part of life, and you just need to be responsible about it. And, you know, I felt the pressure from other family members, but not so much from my parents. I think, you know, and the community was really very much into slut-shaming women in particular who were sexually active. So that was kind of a, I remember in particular some girls in high school that they were pretty actively slut-shamed, even though the guys that they were having sex with, they were held up as, you know, the jocks and studs, and, you know, they got a lot of support for having sex. The girls, not so much.
I was definitely discouraged not to have sex until I was married. When I became pregnant at the age of 19, and when I had to tell my dad, which is probably one of the most terrifying things I've ever had to do, he was shocked. He was like, "Well, I guess I know you're having sex now." And it just kind of, I was sexually active at the age of 16. So for 3 years, he had no idea. It was in total denial. And if it weren't for a really good friend I had in high school who actually works for the ACLU now, I wouldn't have known about Planned Parenthood. I wouldn't have known about the right and wrong way to do things.
There was definitely a lot of encouragement to wait for marriage when I was growing up. My mom was Catholic and my dad's family was Southern Baptist, so I also got kind of the best of both worlds in terms of conservative religious upbringing. My parents got more liberal as I got older and as we moved out of the South and up to Washington, which is a very liberal state. But even then, I started dating my husband when I was 16, and until recently, he was the only person I'd ever had sex with. But when I was 18, even then, my dad called me a slut and told me that there was more to life than getting my pussy fucked. So even, becoming more liberal and moving past that slut shaming and that waiting until marriage aspect, most of the time, there were still elements of it until later in my life.
I was lucky because my father thought that if I was raised by my mother, it meant that I would turn out gay because I was lacking his dominant influence. So, when I visited him, he would try to set me up and arrange situations where I would have opportunities. Very advantageous when your father's, testosterone poisoned and suspects you might be gay.
Do you think if you were a girl that your experience would have been different, that you might have been shamed for having sex instead?
Oh, I'm sure.
And Aron, I wanted to comment that, I totally got that gay vibe from you right away. So.
Yeah.
Well, let's examine this. How many of us really think that sex as an adult is something somebody should be ashamed of, male or female?
Totally shouldn't be ashamed of it. It's just normal human behavior.
Unless you're with the religious right, and if you're really with the religious right, then you're gonna try to suppress it and suppress it and suppress it, and the only time it's going to come out that you had sex at all is when it is discovered that you have gone to rent a boy, and then gone to a cabana in Brazil with somebody advertising in that magazine, or when you're caught for child porn, or when you're caught diddling some kid, or when you're in some other thing with prostitutes and you find yourself on your televangelism show crying an apology that you don't really believe in. This is what you get. You get somebody trying to suppress one of the strongest drives that we have, and I don't understand what it is about sex that terrifies religious people. But it's consistent, and it doesn't seem to matter what religion it is, as long as one of the mainstream ones. Then these people have huge problems with it.
They're still having it though. 80% of them are still having sex, but yet they're
lying about it. And they're trying to control everybody else's sex life. They can't control their own. I mean, this is why you have the monasteries. What was the monasteries all about? I mean, what goes on over there? Why do they join these things? And the nunneries. I mean, all of these things are based on a weird sort of repression, which then only seems to put the focus on the perversity that emerges as a result of that. Or at least it looks to be a result of that.
Could it be that abstinence only is unhealthy for adults? It's an unhealthy sexual attitude?
I think that if someone is voluntarily abstinent for whatever reason, then that's a personal choice. But when it's something that's imposed on people that they wouldn't choose, I think that's very unhealthy for people. And I think it, if you talk to people that have been involved in very fundamentalist religious organizations, and then they've gone on and they've played by the rules, they've gotten married, they've, been there on their wedding night, and they've been terrified because, they've been taught their whole life that this behavior was sinful, and now suddenly they're expected to do it with this person. And it's terrifying for them. I think it's pretty sad. It really screws people up.
I think Aron really hit it on the head when he said control, because sex is one of the strongest drives that we have. And if the church tries to control that, they create this never-ending cycle of guilt, and you have to assuage your guilt, and you have to go to the church to get rid of your guilt for feeling something that's natural and normal. And it's how they get you. It's how they control you.
And I really agree with Jen. If you make the decision to be abstinent, if you decide that that's a lifestyle for you, whether it's because you identify as asexual or for whatever reason you're just not interested in having sex, then that's a perfectly valid and healthy lifestyle. But if you're pursuing abstinence because you've been shamed and intimidated and coerced into it, then that's unhealthy.
Or what if you have sexual drives that you're ashamed of and don't want to admit, anyone to know about, or you don't want to admit to? Who knows how many times before homosexuality had any kind of degree of acceptance in society? Who knows how many times people became priests or entered the monastery because they were trying to conceal this aspect of themselves.
Well, yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I think that's, I don't know, it's hard to say why it seemed like there's this critical mass of pedophiles among Catholic priests, but I think there might be some substance to the idea that people that have these drives that they know are completely unacceptable, the idea that there's an organization that promises that it can heal you of these things, and in worst case you end up in a situation where it's largely only men, and nobody's supposed to be having sex, so someone who has inclinations in that direction could end up in the priesthood because he figures it's a safe place, and then he finds out he's the youth minister somewhere, and no one knows about it, and he can't admit it.
Well, then also look at another thing. I mean, like, I've read a lot of the works of Martin Luther, and this man absolutely hated women. He thought they were completely vulgar.
Oh yeah.
He was sexually attracted to them at the same time, and he blamed them for this degree of control over these animalistic urges that he wanted so hardly to deny, that he's above that sort of thing. So he's hating them for his urges.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a fair amount of evidence that Martin Luther he suffered from obsessive compulsive disorder. He apparently was really into various purification rituals.
It's unhealthy psychologically, and I think it's this religious attitudes towards sex are not natural.
Yeah.
And you're imposing something unnatural on others.
Well, now somebody said here that it is possible for various reasons to abstain from sex simply because you're not interested for whatever reason, and she's right. If if you're not driven by this urge, if this isn't something that's overpowering you, I mean, it's not that big a deal in your life. Okay, fine, I can understand. But when you are mastered by this drive, and then you try to suppress it, well, then you're definitely creating a pressure there, and it's gonna break out some way.
Which is why I think comprehensive sex education and fact-based education has been shown to be more effective in just 2 or 3 years here in Texas in the districts that have tried it. They've reduced unplanned pregnancies, I believe, by 40%. Children should be given accurate information about contraception. They should also be persuaded to wait until they are mature enough to handle a sexual relationship.
Yes, and birth control, including condoms, should be readily available to kids. I would say, give them to the nurse at the school and have the nurse distribute them freely to anyone who walks in and requests them. I know that when I was a company commander in the Army, that's how we operated. We had I would get a large box of condoms from the troop medical clinic, and I would keep them in the orderly room. And about Thursday, the box of condoms would come out from behind the counter in the orderly room, and it would go on top of the counter. And we would begin encouraging the soldiers to take one more than you think you'll need for the weekend. And I have an interesting story about a soldier in my company who he was quite offended that there were condoms available. And it turns out he was extremely religious, very fundamentalist, and I actually got a call from his mother, who was deeply upset that we were corrupting her boy because we had condoms available in the orderly room. And I had to explain to her that we're not forcing him to take them. They're there if he needs them. And no, I am not going to put them away and pretend that my soldiers are not having sex.
Did you want to clarify? You used the word kids. What age should they should condoms be readily available in the nurse's office? Do you think?
I would say that probably by junior high, and I don't think you're going to have a lot of junior high school kids going in there and asking for condoms, but certainly there are some kids in junior high who may be sexually active, and I think that condoms should be available to them before you think they're going to need them.
When I was in 6th grade, so a little while ago, we had a number of students my age who were sexually active. So we had 10 and 11 and 12-year-olds who were having sex, and most of them didn't know where to get condoms. We didn't have condoms available at our school, and I wasn't aware of it at the time, but thinking back, they had no way to be protected from STIs, from pregnancy, or from anything else. So I think when you have a population that is starting to reach puberty and that is starting to reach sexual maturity, that's the point when you should have protection available.
And it helps to demystify it too. It makes it something not like this forbidden, naughty thing that you're not supposed to do. It just makes it more real and more safe.
I was giving a speech at a Jewish women's group, and they said that a lot of women or girls that they go to foster homes and give sex education classes and to foster children, and they said a lot of women don't want to carry condoms because you look like you're ready to have sex and you look like you're a slut, and they try to tell them that if you're going to be having sex, then own it, and carry a condom. That there's that thing again. I think it's society's attitudes that are contributing to unplanned pregnancies, of shaming girls for having sex.
Yeah, I agree, and that was one of the messages in my company when I was a company commander, that even if you don't expect to have sex, take a condom anyway, just in case. And if you're female, doesn't mean you don't carry condoms. There's a correct way to store them, and if you want to make sure that the condom you're going to use has been stored correctly, then you need to take responsibility for that. Take the condom, make sure you keep it stored properly so that it doesn't degrade, and then you're going to be protected.
Okay, awesome. I wanted to launch into something else now. Shannon wanted to talk about some of the myths about abortion. Abortion is so hated here in Texas. I know not everybody here is Texas, but we're having a lot of problems. Actually, there have been a lot of bills in state legislatures, not just in Texas, everywhere. Since January 2013, 684 bills have been introduced trying to restrict abortion.
Abortion myths. I wanted to address some of the abortion myths that exist, the kind of misunderstood or made up consequences, and I'll start off with a big one, and that's breast cancer. There's a myth that abortion causes breast cancer. There is, in fact, one entire website called abortionbreastcancer.com devoted to proving this falsehood.
So there is absolutely no scientific evidence that supports the idea that having any number of abortions increases your risk of breast cancer. And in all studies that have ever been done, there is no link, either positive nor negative, towards having an abortion or even using abortion as a form of birth control and getting breast cancer.
What I heard was that there was a study out there that suggested that women who'd had a child had a slightly lower risk of breast cancer, and if you had been pregnant but you had an abortion or you miscarried, then they didn't see the same benefit, and the anti-abortion people interpreted that as an increased risk of breast cancer, which is completely dishonest. And I don't think that very slight reduction in breast cancer risk was replicated in follow-up studies. At least I didn't hear of it. So, yeah, I think it was a completely dishonest presentation of one study that showed a very slight reduction in risk if you had a child.
Well, I read the article she's talking about, and I think the correlation was that if you have more periods over your reproductive lifespan, that correlates to a higher risk of breast cancer. So if you've carried to full term, that's 9 months where you don't have a period, whereas if you abort, you it's less months, by 4 months at least, right? And yeah.
Well, what I had heard was that was true for ovarian cancer. But maybe somebody showed that with breast cancer as well. But the other thing is that if it's a matter of the number of cycles that you go through, you can shut that down with birth control pills.
So according to the National Cancer Institute, it says that pregnancy may reduce a woman's chance of developing some cancers, including ovarian and endometrial cancers, but that's not necessarily true of breast cancer.
Right. I looked at some of the studies and I read what the pro-life articles were saying, and I looked at the studies that they looked at. And basically, like Lalandra said, the less frequently your breast cells are exposed to certain hormones, the less likely you are to get breast cancer. And because during pregnancy you're not menstruating, it does lower your risk of breast cancer significantly. In fact, and I thought this was very interesting for the kind of website it was, the abortion breast cancer website advocates teenage pregnancy. It says that being pregnant as a teenager lowers your risk for breast cancer. Now, while that may be true, is it really worth being a teenage mom to have a slightly lower risk of breast cancer? And additionally, the reason why the pro-lifers are saying, like Jen said, that abortion increases your risk for breast cancer is because you're not having that full-term pregnancy. So it's not that abortion increases your risk, it's that not being pregnant it increases your risk. In the study that they cited, not being pregnant at all, not having any pregnancies at all, increases your risk 6-fold over miscarriages or abortion. So that's where their facts are coming from.
Is anyone broadcasting this kind of information? Is anybody publicizing this?
I just recently did in my blog.
Well, let me see. Let me weigh this here. My teenage daughter getting pregnant so she doesn't get cancer, or me putting my daughter on regulatory birth control? Which one? Right?
Right.
And to be honest, I don't know that this is a very commonly believed myth anymore. We get a lot of questions about abortion and the consequences of abortion at Planned Parenthood, and this is one that I have not encountered. So I think this may be one of those myths that's kind of fallen by the wayside, and fact has finally won out over fiction on this one.
I'm hoping so. I know that crisis pregnancy centers use that to dissuade women from getting abortions, which is unfortunate.
That and they use it to dissuade them from even getting Plan B. So if they come in and they've had, unprotected sex or, whatever, and they ask for Plan B, they get told, no, you're going to increase your risk of breast cancer. You don't want that.
Right, yes. That site also says that birth control increases your risk for breast cancer. Now, I did look into that as well, and there is a bit of truth to that. It does increase the risk slightly when you take it as a teenager, but when you stop taking it, after about 10 years of not taking birth control anymore, your risk goes right back down to normal, like you never took it in the first place. So it's really not I mean, of course, you would have to talk to your doctor and consider your personal risk and consequences, but I mean, considering the facts is a lot better than considering the myths.
Yeah, let's consider the slightly increased risk of breast cancer from taking birth control pills with the significantly increased risk of being pregnant as a teenager.
Yes.
Because it's extremely dangerous for teenagers to be pregnant.
Yes, it
They
is.
have a much higher risk of complications than women in their 20s.
Let's move on to fetal pain.
Is this where I get to talk about my bunions?
One of the reasons for the resurgence of all this abortion legislation is supposed new studies showing that a fetus at 20 weeks can feel pain.
It is a common argument of the anti-choice groups that fetuses can feel pain at 20 weeks. Based on the most up-to-date science that we have, especially on fetal brain development, fetuses don't have the physiology to feel pain until at least 28 or 29 weeks into pregnancy. So if we're basing it on the most up-to-date science and the most up-to-date information that we have, that's completely inaccurate. There's at least another 2 months after that point before they can feel pain. And at 28 or 29 weeks into pregnancy, abortions are only done if the mother's life is at risk. So there is very little moral argument there as to whether or not that's an acceptable situation.
If I didn't know any better, I would say that you guys are going to tell me that that religion is lying to us all.
You think?
I can't imagine we would ever say that.
Yeah, I will. I'll say it.
That was sarcasm, for the record.
Yeah. Yeah, what Taylor was saying about the fetal pain issue is in line with every bit of research I've been able to come up with. I saw an article, actually it was an entry on a blog by an OBGYN probably about a year and a half ago that talked about this, and she's of the opinion that there's probably not going to be any sensation of pain in a fetus even before probably 30 weeks, but certainly 28 weeks is a very conservative estimate of when a fetus might begin to experience anything like pain. 20 weeks, no way. The neurological development's just not there.
So, if I can understand what you're saying, at 25 weeks, abortions are only done in cases of harm to the mother. So these fetal pain bills are mostly blocking people in emergency situations, because I know here in Texas, you're not even allowed an exception for that. The fetal pain bill here, the 20-week bill here, the one they're pushing right now.
So Washington State has very liberal laws when it comes to abortion, and it is legal up to 25 weeks, largely because a lot of genetic testing can't be done until that point. And so it gives parents the option to decide, based on genetic testing, if they want to continue the pregnancy. But even at that point, at 25 weeks, it's not possible for a fetus to feel pain. They don't have the physiology for it. They don't have the mental and physical capacity to feel pain.
Right. From what I read, the neurological connections haven't been made.
Yeah, that's exactly what I've been able to come up with, looking at not the anti-choice sites, but actual medical doctors who deal with this issue. That there's just not the neurological connections to feel pain, that early, and along the lines with this being able to do any kind of testing. I mean, for normal pregnancies where you don't suspect there's any problem, you don't get your first ultrasound until 20 weeks. And at the 20-week ultrasound in Texas, you now can't get an abortion. If you find out that you're carrying a fetus that has just catastrophic problems, that will not survive. You can't get an abortion in Texas now, or at least you won't be able to if these laws pass. But, my other question about this whole fetal pain thing is that, beyond a certain point, and I think it's 15 or 16 weeks, abortion isn't, they don't use the vacuum method for abortion at that point. It's basically an induction. And so if you can't do an induction without pain medication to the fetus, does that mean that if a woman goes in and needs to have labor induced, is the doctor required to provide pain medication prior to inducing the woman? I mean, because I would object to that. There are side effects to pain medication, and if you're trying to deliver a baby, you don't necessarily want your baby's respiration and normal responses affected by some kind of pain medication. So, I mean, there's all kinds of unintended consequences to these laws that these people are passing.
I know that at abortions, at those phases, they actually kill the fetus first with an injection usually. So
yes.
They can't even, I mean, if you're not alive anymore, even if you had the capacity to feel pain to begin with, being dead removes that. And then one of the arguments for fetal pain that I was reading on, and then I also read a rebuttal, was that when they do any kind of surgery on a fetus, they they anesthetize it first. And so that was the support for, well, they must feel pain or else why would you do that? And the reason why they do that is so that the fetus doesn't move and so that the surgery isn't compromised.
Yeah.
So, I know that when Rick Perry was talking about this legislation, he was talking about safety. We want to pass these bills to make, our women safer. But the fact is that pregnancy is much more dangerous than an abortion is for anybody. I think you're 14 times more likely to die from childbirth than from an abortion.
One of the things I didn't see in any of the presentations about this, especially when people were talking about safety for women, I didn't see any presentation about how dangerous abortion is in Texas. How many women are dying from abortions in various clinics throughout Texas because, they're just not safe enough. The hallways are not wide enough and these women are dying because, we can't get the gurney in for the ambulance to take them to the hospital. And so, I mean, I think if they had those numbers, they would have presented them because that would be pretty compelling. And it would actually point to some kind of legitimate secular purpose for this law. But I think it's very interesting that they didn't present any numbers like that. It makes me think they don't have them.
They don't. It's very safe. An abortion, I believe, and I guess Taylor, definitely tell me if I'm wrong, but an abortion at 13 weeks and earlier is essentially a D&C. And the Mayo Clinic said that D&Cs are very safe and that complications are very rare.
Well, the procedure can vary from doctor to doctor depending on what they're most comfortable with. For most first trimester abortions, they use vacuum aspiration. So it's a 5 to 10 minute procedure. They offer you pain medication, they dilate your cervix, and then they use vacuum aspiration to remove the products of conception. And the risk of complications in a first trimester procedure are extremely low. For example, less than 0.3% of patients experience any kind of complication that requires hospitalization. There are essentially no long-term problems. Abortion doesn't cause infertility. It doesn't increase your risk of ectopic pregnancies. It doesn't increase your risk of having miscarriages. There's, like we discussed earlier, there's no risk for breast cancer. There's no increased risk for breast cancer. And I don't remember the exact number, but it's less than 1% of women who experience any kind of complication, like even an infection, or anything like that following a first trimester procedure. So especially when compared to the risks that women face during pregnancy and childbirth, the risk of complications during medical or during in-clinic abortions during vacuum aspiration procedures is almost non-existent.
So why isn't this testimony making it to the floor in the Senate? What are they talking about?
Because it's based on facts instead of fear.
I mean, it has made it. They've had doctors send in testimony. It's there. It's there. They're just ignoring it. And there are more people ignoring it than there are paying attention to it. And so that's what happens.
Our legislators are ignoring scientific evidence.
Yes.
I could also throw in, it's from the Guttmacher Institute's website, the risk of death associated with abortion in the first 2 months of pregnancy is about 1 per million abortions. So the risk of pregnancy is significantly higher than that. I can't quote the exact figure, but 1 per million is an extremely low number.
If I could cut in.
Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why a lot of these facts aren't reaching the floor, or if they are reaching the floor, they aren't reaching the media or anybody who's like watching the floor or paying attention to C-SPAN, is because these facts are boring. And talking about things that I mean, unless you're actually considering getting an abortion, then you don't care about these facts. What you care about is life or death, rights or no rights, and whether or not you feel subjugated as a woman. Now, I've been reading up on all of the Wendy Davis stuff for the show, right? And I saw like images of like women just like sitting inside the Capitol during her filibuster, and everybody just being I got choked up seeing this woman do this and seeing all these people behind her. And it was almost easy to forget that this was about something as mundane as, well, seemingly mundane as abortion regulation, something that, unless you're deeply pro-life or pro-choice activist, nobody actually cares that much about. Now, the thing is that the reason why everybody's all into it is not because of abortion. They don't necessarily care about abortion. What they care about is women, and there are so many pissed off women in your state. And there's this book that I read, right? It was called Pull of the Moon. It was actually a gift for somebody, and I read it. I just read it all in one sitting before I gave it to him. It was about a woman who was going into menopause, and it's like written in first person, almost like a journal. And she talks about how, as she started to go through the change, she started to remember who she was before puberty, how she wanted to be an astronaut, how she wanted to be an architect or an explorer, an anthropologist. She remembered having rock collections and being interested in science. And then all of a sudden she starts puberty, all of her cool stuff goes into the closet, and then it's just boy magazines and makeup. Like, as soon as she started having her period, everything had to do with sex and the responsibility that she was somebody who bore children. And then all of a sudden she goes through menopause, and that weight is lifted, and she went back to being herself. She stopped coloring her hair, started just being herself again. Abortion and birth control gives that power to every single woman, regardless of how old she is or whether or not she's fertile. And that's something that the religious right wants to make sure that women do not have. The entire justification of keeping women in the home, of keeping, women in subservient roles, women can't have certain jobs. That was all based on the fact that a woman could get pregnant at any time. Take that away, and women can do anything. Now, men can't have that, or at least these religious right motherfuckers can't have that. That's the real issue. That's why nobody's talking about these facts, because the facts about abortion are not the issue. Women are.
But we're protecting women and their infant children. That's the way Perry sells it. And all of these women, these 1,000 women that were in the Capitol, raging protest at their legislators who were fudging official documents and putting down false dates and ignoring data and lying to their constituents. the way that they sell this is that these women are impeding their ability to protect them, because you have to spin it somehow into something that doesn't make any sense in order to get your personal agenda through and maintain control.
Yeah, but you see, the most protected thing that I could think of in America off the top of my head is Fort Knox. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out. In order to fully protect women, you have to put them in the middle room, in the harem, and not let them see the light of day.
There's this mentality about women, and it's like that old saying, women and children. Why are women put into the same category as children? We can take care of ourselves. We're adults. We can do everything self-sustaining. We're not children. Why are we put in the same category as them?
Because we're the children makers and we're supposed to take care of the children.
And there's still this idea that women are inferior, that women are stupid, that women are incapable of making rational decisions because we are overwhelmed by our emotions, we are overwhelmed by hormones, and we can't possibly be level-headed and logical like men. And
yeah, I want to contest that.
Well, back in the day,
I'm sorry to interrupt. I should have waited, but I do want to contest that. I understand why I would feel the need to protect the women and children, and that the men, if you go back to a tribalistic standpoint, which is where this all comes from, of course, we're supposed to be we're the protectors, we're the hunters, and the staple then of the tribe is the women and children. And it's not that they're not adults, it's not that you can't make decisions, but it's a level of self-sacrifice that it's at least the way I see it, where I'm putting somebody who's more important than I am, and that's the noble thing to do. That's the way I was raised anyway. That's the way I have to look at it.
Well, see, back in the day, when these stereotypes about women being hormonal and irrational came about, it was quite normal for women to be married off at the age of 15. What 15-year-old do you know makes wise decision and isn't like hormonal and mood swingy and irrational, especially when they're being forced into an adult situation?
And also the idea that, men are the hunters, men are the gatherers, and women need to be protected because of that is, to me at least, a completely crap gender stereotype that doesn't really have any application in modern society. In a country, especially, for example, the US, where women are quickly becoming the majority of the breadwinners, and where stay-at-home dads are becoming far more normal, it's a little bit ridiculous to have politicians making decisions based on tribalistic ideals, that women are the homekeepers and the child bearers and the child rearers. So I understand where you're coming from, but I think that it's time that we move past that and look at women as the independent, self-sustaining, capable human beings that they are, instead of defining them by their reproductive organs or their ability to continue the family name or the lineage.
Well, and I think that's an important point, because it's not about who makes the money and who stays at home and raises the kids. It's this idea that you get to make your own decisions about what happens to your body, and I think that these religious people that talk about forcing women to remain pregnant when they don't want to, they simply don't understand the concept of consent. People can consent to all kinds of things. That's basically what pro-choice is all about. If you are pro-choice, you may decide that your choice is to continue with a pregnancy, in which case you actively consent every single day to remain pregnant until you give birth to that child. If you withdraw your consent at any point, my view on that is that you have the right to terminate that pregnancy at any point. So at the moment you decide that you no longer consent to let this fetus use your body anymore, you can terminate the pregnancy. This is the same model that we use for any kind of medical intervention. If you go into the emergency room and they tell you, look, you need a blood transfusion or you're going to die, you can say, I don't consent to a blood transfusion. And they have to respect that. You have refused that medical intervention. At the same time, you can walk in and say, you know what, I want the blood transfusion. I don't want to die. And if the medical people treating you don't believe that blood transfusions are moral, they have no right to withhold that from you. But this is what we have here. We've got a group of people who think they can substitute their own judgment for a subset of the human population that they have deemed, are making the wrong decision in their view. And they're saying, absent your consent, I'm going to force you to abide by a decision that I would make, not one that you would necessarily make.
The Wendy Davis Filibuster and Women's Rights in Politics.
After the filibuster, Rick Perry commented that Wendy Davis was a teenage mother from a teenage mother family, and that she should have learned from her own example, since she went on to Harvard and now is a state senator in the Texas legislature. Only Wendy can know what choices she should have made, whether she should have used birth control, whether she needed an abortion. Rick Perry doesn't know jack about what every woman in the state needs, what choices they need to make. And the mostly male legislature just keeps going, not just in Texas, everywhere. They just keep insisting that they know better than adult women do. Well, there are a few teenagers, but it's preposterous.
Even more preposterous is the fact that when Wendy Davis was a pregnant teenager, they seem to overlook the fact that she was married at the time, and so it wasn't like, she was going into this thinking she'd be a single mom. I'm sure that she made decisions based on this idea that she would, have the father of her child there with her. But all that aside, what they seem to overlook is that at the time Wendy Davis was a teenage mom, abortion was available to her. She made the choice that she could live with. The point is, she had a choice. And that's the important thing. I don't care what choice a woman makes. I care that she has the choice.
If I may, given this question, I think that abortion is a grossly irresponsible method of birth control, if that is all that it's used for. I've known at least one person who had gone through the maximum number of abortions before the state wouldn't let her get an abortion anymore. And this person I didn't have a whole lot of respect for. The way that they're doing the legislation, however, they're not taking into account that, whereas I would prefer, given the choice, I'm going to make a very serious decision. It is a very serious decision, and I wouldn't want to terminate the pregnancy, my own self personally, unless there were reasons that I should. Not simply for my own vanity or what have you. When the situation arose when I first found out that I was going to be a father, of course, my girlfriend at the time pondered the idea, and I thought, no, this is inconvenient as all hell, and this is going to be a real bind, but I want to go ahead with this, right? And that's just the stance that I am. I'm pro-choice, and this is my choice also. But the legislation that they're doing eliminates a necessity. It removes a possibility when there needs to be a necessity. When and I'm saying this so badly, they don't allow that very young people can get pregnant and be in a dangerous situation. They don't allow that people can be raped and they just have to deal with that. In some places, they give the rapists, who impregnate women, they give them parental rights. What the hell's that? They don't understand that there are circumstances where a woman's life is going to be compromised, like there was a recent news story in South America where this woman is petitioning to the government to allow her in, and the government is petitioning to the church to permit her to get an abortion because her life will be threatened if the pregnancy continues. They don't allow, like in some of the extreme stories where you hear where somebody's raped by their father, and you get the genetic inbreeding thing, and then when you have the crack baby thing, or you have some terrible infection and you already know the child's not going to survive. There's no option when it needs to be, and the state shouldn't have the right to decide when these situations arise. It should be the individual's choice. Whether there is a medical need, which is the only reason that I would choose it myself personally, but I understand other people have other reasons.
Here's one thing we haven't touched on either. If Texas passes some of these laws that they want to, which they're going to, because they have the majority now, some of the regulations that they put on abortion clinics will effectively close every clinic in Texas except for 4. So it will outlaw in a lot of parts of Texas safe and legal abortions. So even if you don't choose that for you, wouldn't you want other women to have the option of a safe and legal abortion rather than a back alley abortion, or going somewhere where the medical the hospital isn't as safe, like Mexico?
And the irony of this is that by defunding Planned Parenthood in Texas, they have simultaneously increased the need for abortion while reducing its availability. And so what we're going to end up with is a whole bunch of kids that were unplanned. Many of them will be unwanted, and I think there's a difference between unplanned and unwanted. You can not plan to get pregnant but still want to have the kid. But we're going to have a bunch of unwanted kids out there, and most people won't give them up for adoption. That's like the panacea that all of the anti-abortion people throw out there. That, you could just give them up for adoption, but that's not realistic in most cases. And so I think we're going to have a lot more poor kids out there with a lot fewer services available, and I just.
That's the other thing you got to throw out there. There's a lot fewer services are going to be available because
Yeah.
You're right. They're ruining both sides of this. They're not just creating a situation where we're going to have more unplanned kids. We're creating a situation where they have less avenues of support. They've tried to get rid of WIC, Women and Infant Children, the welfare benefits program that I took advantage of when I was a single father of an infant. And I was the only man that was not accompanied when I was sitting in the WIC office, but I didn't make any sexist comments about the situation there. It didn't bother me. I was glad that the program existed when I needed it. They're trying to get rid of. Perry actually tried to get rid of public school, and they wanted to get rid of kindergarten. They want to get rid of all of the primary schools, everything that could benefit struggling young parents in need of assistance. And I understand that every time I try to say, well, you shouldn't do both of these things, well, then somebody wants to yell that I'm a socialist because I'm promoting these social programs. All I'm saying is have a degree of balance. You can't guarantee that we're going to have an over surplus of all these kids and then take away everything that would have supported them. You're creating a negatively reinforced situation, and I don't understand how anybody doesn't see that.
Yeah, I don't see how people don't see that either, because there are some things that really do work, and one of the things that works when you have really poor kids out there is that if you can get them into pre-K or kindergarten as quickly as possible, that's a net benefit for everyone, because they're more likely to graduate from high school if you get them into those programs early, and they're less likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. And the thing is, if we have a whole bunch of poor kids out there with no support services, that is not a fiscally conservative situation to be in. We are going to pay for this one way or the other. So you can either pay for services like Planned Parenthood, where people control their own fertility and they have the number of kids that they planned for and that they wanted, or you can defund Planned Parenthood and have a whole bunch of unplanned and unwanted kids and pay a lot more for it later on.
When they do the teaching of abstinence only, right? It is every program that the religious right gets behind works in reverse. I mean, with the teaching abstinence only does not minimize teen pregnancies. It increases it substantially.
Yeah.
These costs to the state, like right now, the state isn't paying what it should it used to educate every child. The per student costs are down because we have so many immigrants to the state. Imagine multiplying those costs that we can't afford now with many more unplanned pregnancies, and if you don't educate these unplanned pregnancies or crisis pregnancies, how about the cost to the state of incarcerating these children who are not educated and don't have very many advantages? It's incredibly stupid public policy.
Or an incredibly smart one, seeing as a lot of these kids, their only way out of the situation will be to go into the military.
Well, even at that, I don't think that's a very viable option, because, I mean, we, one of the things that happened with the military when we got involved in, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we ended up having to lower the standards so far, the recruiting standards, to the point where we're letting convicted felons in. And, that's coming home to roost now. We've got a sexual assault epidemic, which, that's been going on for a long time, but, it's kind of exploded in the last couple of years. And this is one of many things that happens when you let people in that shouldn't be in. When the standards go down, I think that, the military, when we're no longer involved in 2 wars that we shouldn't have been involved in the first place, the standards will go up again. There won't be that many opportunities for poor kids to get in the military. And so these very undereducated kids who probably, by the time, if they grow up this poor, they will probably have interactions with the criminal justice system, and they'll be ineligible to get in the military. So even at that, it's, it's a bad public policy all around. In the case of Rick Perry, I don't even know that he thinks about it in those terms. I think for him, it's a matter of, if I cut, this many millions of dollars out of these programs for poor people, I can give this many millions of dollars in tax breaks and perks to my business buddies. I think he's very much, I think he's pretty much doing it, as an economic thing.
Yeah, and that does make a lot more sense as far as just the individual goes. However, there is a very scary picture being painted.
Definitely.
By all of this, that it really does make me wonder what goes on in some of these people's heads. Not just the not just the politicians, obviously, but the people supporting this legislation. What do they think is going to come out of this?
Okay, first question: we have an all-volunteer military. Not everybody, even if they want to fight more wars, is going to volunteer to join the military. And we incarcerate right now the most people on the planet because of the drug wars. So they don't wind up in the military, and some do, but a lot don't. A lot wind up in prison. And 2, what do they want out of it? What do they get out of it? Bottom line with GOP is taxes.
Yeah.
They don't want to pay more taxes to support women's health. They don't want to pay more taxes to support education. What they care about is keeping more of their own money. They don't see down the road that they will make more money with a more educated populace. They're in the here and now. They are also wanting to please their religious donors by enacting all of this anti-woman legislation.
Yeah, that really is the bottom line of it, and it really sucks that their constituents are the ones giving the money to these churches, who are then passing the money on to the politicians. And you would not, just the level of ignorance that there is here in the Midland, you would not believe the kind of things that I hear out of people's mouths as to, well, this is why they're doing this is why they're doing that, and yeah, I mean, it's down to the money, and it's down to just the immediate benefit.
Rick Perry is very short-sighted. He's just trying to keep people happy so that he can stay in office, so that the money is going to the right places.
A lot of the GOP can't make it out into the office without being indebted to the religious right donors. So they made promises that they need to keep. I'm not just saying GOP. Sometimes, a lot of times, Democrats too are beholden to corporations and special interest groups. Okay, let's move on to the Wendy Davis filibuster. How many of you guys watched that going on when it happened?
I did.
Yeah, I was actually in Arizona when it was happening, but I caught the news reports of it after the fact. It was pretty awesome.
So Taylor did?
Yes, I was watching it streaming online.
Me and Aron watched it live too. It was really exciting. I am very cynical about politics. Have a lot of people have good reasons to be cynical about it. But when I was watching her standing there, and her voice never broke, and she talked for hours, and she never leaned on anything, or she just stood tall and straight, and you could tell with her it was all about the principle that what the legislature was doing was wrong. I've never seen somebody stand on principle like that, not a politician, and she kind of restored some of my faith in politics, even though ultimately...
Are you aware of the catheter? I was not aware when we were watching it live. I was not aware that she had been catheterized. This is how much pre-planning she had done to make sure that she could do the entire duration. Think about that.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I did not know that she was catheterized either.
Yeah, there's commitment.
Yeah, that's a pretty intense level of commitment.
I didn't know politicians like her existed anymore. Because everybody, like we were just saying, is so beholden to special interests and corporations, and they give lip service to doing the right thing. Like, they have all of these dramatic speeches now, like Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst, about how the filibuster was just an unruly mob, and they're actually doing the right thing. But 80% of Texans don't want this legislation. They're not representing Texas citizens. They're representing their special interests.
When over 3/4 of your population says that they don't believe their legislative body should be involved in these type of affairs, and yet you insist on doing it anyway, that shows that you're not concerned about your constituents, and you're not concerned about the people that you were elected to represent. So that she could stand up there for 12 hours, be catheterized, have her back brace, and deal with all of the abuse that was heaped upon her to represent what Texans wanted was a fantastic moment. I think for Texas and for women's rights.
Now, the way that Perry sold that was in saying that because there was a Republican majority here, that means that all of these people had elected positions. They all were elected to be the representatives, and so they are what the people want. That's actually how he pitched that in the news.
Yeah, and thanks to gerrymandering, he's so diluted the votes for people that would throw these guys out. You know, he's going to get the Republican Senate and the Republican ledge that he needs to get his legislation through.
make himself richer, these other legislatures making themselves richer, cutting deals, and what the people actually want isn't important.
Well, and you know, it's probably useful at this point to explain to listeners how the Texas Ledge works. I mean, we don't have a professional legislature. The Ledge is only in session every other year, and they don't get paid very much. And a lot of people say, well, you know, you don't want to pay them very much because, you know, they just go in and screw things up. But what that means is that if you're not independently wealthy, you probably can't even consider running for the legislature. So automatically, you've got a very carefully selected group of people who are even going to be eligible to run because they're the ones who can afford it. So that, you know, they are definitely looking after their own when they get into office.
They limit the they don't pay them a salary because the reasoning was they didn't want to have career politicians. But that's exactly what they have. Look at Rick Perry.
Oh yeah, and of course he gets paid quite well. He gets paid well, and he gets lots of perks for being the governor. But you know, the regular politicians, the senators and the legislators, they don't get paid very much at all. In fact, I bet what they pay them barely covers their expenses. But you know, again, this is why you know, you won't find, you know, some poor person from the valley who actually understands what it means when you start cutting programs like they've cut here. You won't find someone like that in the Texas Ledge because they can't afford to.
I contacted Wendy Davis's office and invited myself to come down for a meeting because I wanted to represent, as you know, do something in the capacity of Texas State Director of American Atheists. But what I sent in the letter of introduction, which is what they asked me to do, send an email explaining who I was and why I wanted to talk. I summarized my statement in promoting, in encouraging Wendy Davis to run for governor. I said that she has an untapped resource in the secular community, the free thought community, the atheists, agnostics, the science educators, and so on. That all of these people, the humanists and all of them, were completely behind her. Obviously, if you're going to go against the religious right, then the irreligious are going to side with you. But I also added in there that it wasn't a matter of voting for the lesser evil, that we actually look at her as somebody who is principled and somebody that we want to support, and that we were delighted to have somebody that was principled and could actually unseat the incompetent incumbent. So I pleaded with her to please run, and that we, I said, the atheists, agnostics, humanists, and so on, well, that we own the internets, and that we would campaign vigorously on her behalf, whether she wanted to acknowledge our support or not.
Yeah, good.
It was an amazing scene, and it was amazing to watch all the thousands of people who supported her online. Like, there were like 180,000 people online watching it and live, and there were, I think, about 1,000 in the gallery cheering for her. And still, the majority of the Texas legislature doesn't know that what they want is not what everybody else wants. And this anti-abortion legislation is expected to pass because the governor called a second session to pass it despite this filibuster. And what my question is where do we go from here? They are re-electing a few positions in 2014, including governor, and Rick Perry is waiting, they say, till after the special session to announce whether he's running again.
Whether Perry runs or not, okay, the GOP had on that evening shown us in front of 180,000 people watching the live stream. They showed us that they will lie and they will cheat and they will fudge the official documents just to pass through that erroneous vote. They didn't know. that the live stream had so many people watching it, and they didn't know that the documents that they're working on were already screenshotted the moment that they existed. It took 3 hours to explain to Bob Dewhurst that you're not getting away with this. The world already knows. Other countries were watching this session. Everybody knows that you fudged these figures and that you faked these documents, and this will not go through. So they've revealed themselves to be very villainous people. And then, of course, they'd have to make the catty remarks against her so that could it be possible for Perry to seem any more villainous than he already is, or to make her shine any better than she already does? She could walk through this election. If Perry does not run, the one that is the favorite to come in after him is an even more fundamentalist Christian than he was. Somebody whose Facebook shows him posing with the Ten Commandments statue, because that's what he's all about. And the Democratic Party, their favorite was somebody that they weren't necessarily happy with, from what I gather. They never even gave a name. They were looking for someone better than the options that were currently available. And so the Democratic Party want Wendy Davis. And so pretty much to the rest of us.
I had some questions about the future livelihood of Planned Parenthood in Texas, because the legislation is going to pass. Rick Perry will make sure that it passes. So what's going to happen to Planned Parenthood when that occurs?
It's really difficult to say. Planned Parenthood Federation of America is broken up into a lot of different affiliates. So, for example, in Washington State, we have 3 separate affiliates, 1 for Eastern Washington and 2 for Western Washington. And the fundraising for each of them is independent. How they're run is completely independent. So I think the future of Planned Parenthood throughout Texas is going to depend on how each of the different affiliates there are able to adapt to new regulations, how they're able to get funding, if they're able to build up even more base support. And honestly, I really think that this is going to be beneficial in that regard, because there are so many people that are so infuriated by what Texas is doing. Like, even here in Spokane, we had a fundraiser recently, and there were protesters outside. And that led to people who were just passing by, stopping and making donations because they were so angry about the protesters. And so if you look at that on a larger scale, what's happening in Texas, I think that Planned Parenthood does have the opportunity to take advantage of that and to use it to build grassroots support, to increase their fundraising, and to encourage people to participate, to elect people who are supportive of Planned Parenthood and supportive of women's rights. And in the short term, I'm not sure exactly what they can do with Rick Perry as governor and with the conservative legislature, but in the long term, it does give them a good opportunity to turn things around.
Taylor, can you recommend places where people, if they want to help, if they want to donate or learn what they can do, can you recommend a few places that they can go to?
So you can easily Google and find your local Planned Parenthood affiliate. So even if you just go to plannedparenthood.org, it gives you the option to put in your zip code, which helps you find the health center that's closest to you. And you can make a donation either to the Planned Parenthood Federation of America national organization or to your local branch. If you don't want to do it online, you're also able to call the local branch. Each health center has people who are able to take donations. There are also a variety of different organizations like NARAL Pro-Choice and different local organizations that help fund abortions for women who don't have insurance or for women who need birth control but can't afford that. And so I would recommend doing a quick Google search of maybe abortion fund providers and then your city, or just donate directly to your local Planned Parenthood.
Also, the nuns will post on our Facebook page, that's nuns with a 0 instead of an O, some links to where you can go to donate. to help out Planned Parenthood, and they're all pro-choice. There's a separate question too. A lot of the abortion clinics are not equipped like these laws say they need to be. Is there any place that supports them in trying to meet the new regulations? Are these clinics going to close down like they're projected to?
I honestly am not sure as far as Texas goes. I know that it's projected that I think it could reduce the number of abortion providers in Texas to about 5, which would be absolutely catastrophic to women who need reproductive health care and access to safe legal abortion. But unfortunately, I'm just not familiar with Texas organizations, and I'm not able to say what groups might help Planned Parenthood update their systems to be in compliance with the new legislation.
Jen, do you have a word on what people can do to make the situation better?
Well, I think one of the best things we can do is be vocal in our support of Planned Parenthood and what they're doing. And also, I mean, obviously donations help. But right now, if you don't have money, be vocal in your support. And if that means, showing up at the Capitol if you can. If not, post it on Facebook. Make sure that the people that you know on Facebook understand that you support Planned Parenthood. Talk to people in the community. Call your local Planned Parenthood. Ask them what you can do.
I know that Wendy Davis's Facebook page has a link where you can send a letter to Governor Perry. I know that he's not going to listen, but there are several ways where you can send letters from your computer to your representatives. Call your representative if you live in Texas.
Yeah, that's a good point. They need to know that Texans are not by any means universal in their support of this, and in fact, that's been one of the things that's been misrepresented. Most Texans do not support the new restrictions they're placing on abortion. Most Texans actually believe that there are more than enough restrictions on abortion in Texas right now. So what they are carrying out in the legislature is not supported by the majority of Texans. And the more we can get the message out there that is that this is something that's outside of the mainstream, the better.
I also think it's very important to recognize that while this legislation could shut down the majority of Planned Parenthoods in Texas, it doesn't just impact abortion, because abortion is a very small percentage of what all Planned Parenthoods offer. Nationally, it's 3% of what Planned Parenthood does. So by eliminating Planned Parenthoods, these health centers, you're also eliminating access to STI testing and treatment, education, birth control, condoms. You're eliminating access to a wide variety of services that people rely on even more than they rely on the ability to make their own decision in terms of terminating pregnancy or continuing it. So this has far-reaching consequences that extend beyond abortion and into the ability of men and women to take care of themselves, to take care of their reproductive health, and to understand their reproductive rights.
Yeah, I was a little bit amazed that 3 of the women here actually were educated by Planned Parenthood, and we wanted to stay there for other generations of women to benefit from too. I remember as I was growing up, Planned Parenthood was kind of demonized, and I felt ashamed that I was really poor, and I felt ashamed that, and poor women date poor men, that I couldn't afford contraception, and I was married, but I had an unplanned pregnancy. And even for married women, Planned Parenthood is a good resource if you need help obtaining contraception. So it needs to stay. They don't need to close Planned Parenthood down.
Yeah, this is going to sound weird, but I mean, maybe I was just naive or something, or maybe yeah, it's quite possible that the demonization of Planned Parenthood had not reached the fever pitch that it has reached in recent years. But I think I was probably a sophomore in college before I realized that some people didn't like Planned Parenthood because I thought it was the most awesome organization ever. And I was working a Planned Parenthood booth at the state fair, and some people came by and they were making really nasty comments about Planned Parenthood, and specifically about choosing your family size, because one of the messages at the time was every child a wanted child, and they were really harping on that message that, well, all of my kids were wanted. I happened to have 6 of them, but and we're like, yeah, okay, that's cool. you know, what's your point? You know, but yeah, that was like the first inclination I had, or indication that I had, that some people didn't like Planned Parenthood.
I have one more question for Taylor. I guess I'm kind of personally curious, but if you're going to Planned Parenthood and you are paying for their service, like let's assume that you're like in the top, payment bracket, does that help them? Or are they still taking a hit by helping you?
We do some services based on income. So some services, like a lot of birth control or preventative care like pap smears, is sliding scale based on income. If someone doesn't qualify for that, then they pay the full fee. And in that case, that is helping us. Or say if they have insurance and their insurance pays, that is still helping us. So even for a lot of our patients who don't qualify for free healthcare, or for whatever reason they aren't able to pay for the cost of their services, at least Planned Parenthood here in Eastern Washington, we don't send them to collections. If they can't pay their bill, if they're not able to make any payments of any kind, we forgive their debt. So it's a lot better, honestly, financially for us when people do come in who can pay, because that way it kind of helps to offset that cost. Or when people just make donations, because that way it helps us provide that care to people who otherwise couldn't afford it, and it helps us keep our community stronger. So we have a lot of people who call in and they ask, well, I have insurance, can I still come see you? Or I'm not low income, can I still come in for services? And we encourage that, not only because we want to provide healthcare for everyone, but because it does help us to provide healthcare for everyone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Because one thing I've noticed going to see Planned Parenthood, because the services are only a certain kind, if you go in, you can get contraception pretty quickly. You don't have to wait. Like if even if you have a doctor and you call the appointment and you have to wait a month, Planned Parenthood is there in the gap time so that you're not going unprotected.
And we do try to keep our costs as low as possible. So we're a nonprofit organization, so a lot of our costs for healthcare and for treatment are lower than that of private doctors or private offices. So regardless of your income or whether or not you have insurance, you're still paying less when you come to Planned Parenthood.
All right, awesome. Just another reason to support your organization.
I like us.
Final words.
I'm doing the Secular Student Alliance thing a week from now. We are doing the Secular Homeschool Conference in Houston on the 4th at the the Museum of Natural History in Houston. And I think that's all I've got in my immediate future at this moment. Next.
Okay, Jack.
Yeah, I'm the crazy audio-video surgeon who works for this show. I also have a short-form science news show that I host called Brainstorm, and attached to that is a long-form podcast, which is like morning radio DJs, except more cussing and no music, and it's all about science news. I'm also a entertainer, and I provide production and comic relief for the show that you're watching right here.
Okay, Miss Jen.
Yeah, I'm the president of the Atheist Community of Austin, and also a rotating co-host on the Godless Bitches podcast and the Atheist Experience TV show. And within the Atheist Community of Austin, we're having our annual Bat Cruise coming up on September 28th. You can find out more information on the Bat Cruise and all of our media productions at www.atheist-community.org.
Okay, Shannon.
I'm the president of Be Secular, a company that helps secular nonprofits generate income for themselves. I participate enthusiastically in the Nuns, and I have my own blog, Secular Sunshine.
Okay, Taylor.
So I'm the main organizer for Slut Walk Spokane, which is an organization that fights against victim blaming and slut shaming. I work at Planned Parenthood in Spokane, Washington, and I'm on the board of directors for Out Spokane, which puts on Spokane's Pride Parade every year. Just a final follow-up, if you would like to find the Planned Parenthood Health Center closest to you, the best phone number is 800-230-7526, and from there you can be directed to whichever health center is nearest to you.
Okay, that wraps it up. I'm Melandra, and of course I'm the co-host here of the Nuns, and I'm also going to be appearing with the Mr. Ra at the Houston Museum of Natural Science. I'm going to be giving a fancy speech in a real museum about how creationism stifles the curiosity of young children about the natural world. And thank you for joining us today.